Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and to participate in the National Book Festival. I was an early participant. I was here 5 years ago when I discussed the biography which my son and I edited of my father. That perhaps had some impact on me and stimulated me to say something about myself at a later time. And so I've been working for a number of years on my own autobiography, and it was published a few months ago. Let me say first of all that I regard autobiography as a very important but quite distinct branch of history. I try to distinguish it from the memoirs, when you sit down and try to remember what's happened to you over the last X number of years. That is fascinating, to be sure, and it makes a contribution. And I hope that all people will realize that whatever they've done in life is something that ought to be recorded and ought to be passed on to next generations. That's the way we learn. We learn for the future by trying to understand the past. And all of us have a past. We think that maybe the great men or great women have a past, and those of us who are ordinary people don't have a past. We do. And it's very important that we ordinary people record our past. But we can't record our past unless we know it. And we can't just sit around and try to remember it. I undertook that because I hadn't kept any records as a youngster, and not until I was a tenured professor at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, where I had two secretaries who saved my records for the City of New York, and I began to look over their shoulders and see that they might be of some value to me at some point. I want to distinguish quite sharply between autobiography as I see it and memoirs as people call what they they've been able to recollect. This was brought sharply to the attention of all of us a few months ago when James Fry began to confess that A Million Little Pieces was not really autobiography, but a memoir, and he made up a part of it as he went along. And he confessed that. The interesting thing about that development is that he remained on the bestseller list, and Americans seem to have been more fascinated with the tale after he said that he'd been lying than they had been even before he said that. Mirror to America, that I published a few months ago, is not A Million Little Pieces. It's what I could reconstruct of my own life. And it was reconstruction, pure and simple. And what I wrote was, I hope every line was truthful and incontrovertible and unable to be challenged by anyone. Now, I think that autobiography, therefore, is subject to the constraints and rules of any other piece of historical writing. And I sought to apply to my own autobiography what I applied to the biography of George Washington Williams when I published it in 1985. George Washington Williams was a young man in the middle of the 19th century who wrote the first major considerable history of African Americans in the United States. And when I saw those two volumes of his work when I was thinking about writing From Slavery to Freedom, I was astounded that he had put together two volumes called The History of the Negro Race in America. I would be satisfied if I could put one volume together with all of the training and resources that I had when I began to write in his footsteps in 1945. But I subjected him to the scrutiny, the kind of scrutiny that I wanted to be subjected to, that I would subject myself to 40-odd years later when I undertook to do something about my own life. So I stalked him. I stalked him. I went everywhere he went. I studied him. I took notes on him. I read, not only did I read the histories that he wrote, but I went and looked up the sources that he used. And I did everything that I could in my own way to follow in his footsteps, and when necessary to criticize what he had done, or to at least apply the principles of historical criticism to what he had done. And he went to Canada, I went to Canada. He went to the West Coast, I went to the West Coast. He went to Britain and Belgium and the other points in Europe, I went to all those places. He went to Africa, I went to all those places. He went to the Congo, I went up the river. I couldn't go up the river. I went to the river in Kinshasa just to see what he was doing, and discovered there remarkably one person who had been studying him when he was in the Congo, or when he studied him of the time he'd been in the Congo, and that proved to be invaluable to me. The point that I'm making is that in every possible way, I tried to reconstruct his life. And in every possible way, in the same vein, I tried to reconstruct my own life. And if Williams didn't leave any records, I didn't either. When my mother and father wrote to me once a week, as they dutifully did when I was in college, I read the letters, but I didn't have any files or any storage facilities. And I put them where people put things when they don't have any place to store them. I had file 13, and I dropped them in there. And the same thing was true in all of my writings and even in all my travels, until I was brought to my senses that these materials were valuable. So that what I undertook to do was to stalk myself, the way I had stalked George Washington Williams. Fortunately, my wife saved records. She was something of a rat pack, if I may speak without compliment to a person who was passed on. But I was so grateful when I began to try to reconstruct my own life that she was a person who preserved everything. She had this instinctively, despite the fact that she was also trained as a librarian and was doing this sort of naturally. But in addition to that, she was doing it professionally later, and that helped me a great deal. So that in places that I did not go with her, such as my first trip to Australia, my first trip to India, or my first trip to Japan, or my first trip to various parts of South America, I wrote her long letters, and I kept on 2 occasions a diary, and in those instances, I had a rich resources. I had a rich set of resources that I could use when I turned to try to write my own life. In addition to those resources, I had a few other things that were in my favor. I was born in a village in Oklahoma in the early part of this century, of the last century. I keep thinking that I belong to this century, but I belong to that other century.